this is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
But it'll be fun.
Were you offering my question?
Yeah. It can be done.
Take a seat. If you will move from the door and come in to take a seat, we're ready to start the Thomas Glenn Palin Silver Key Debate for the Barkley Forum for High Schools. The teams participating on the affirmative, Stratford High School, and on the negative, Bishop Girton. I would like to introduce the judges for the final round, and we're going to ask you to just hold your applause till the end. Father Raymond Hahn from Pennsylvania, Tim Averill from Massachusetts, Eric D. McKelly from New York, Byron Arthur from Louisiana, Bruce Rogers from Georgia, Ed Williams from Tennessee, Aaron Timmons from Texas, Dan Lingle from Texas, Jim Wade from Georgia, Jane Boyd from Texas, Lisa Miller from Florida, Bill Noonan from Georgia, Warren Sprouse from Iowa, Jay Rye from Alabama, Pam Katie Wyckoff from Minnesota, Tracy McFarland from Texas, Jim Wakefield from Florida, Shante Jordan from Georgia, John Cruz from New York, Andrew West, North Carolina, Bruce Miller from New Hampshire, Lisa Willoughby from Georgia, Tim Mahoney from Texas, Maggie Berthume from Georgia, Kevin Hamrick from Tennessee, Michael Edmonds from Colorado, Greg Malice from Louisiana, Sarah Sanchez from Massachusetts, James Herndon from Georgia. I love all these new key coaches that are coming up the ranks and took those. I love that. Michael Greenstein from Illinois, Dana Randall from Florida, and Father Michael Tidd from New Jersey. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the key coaches of the Barkley Forum in Assembly. I'm going to ask the coaches of the two teams participating in the Silver Key Debate to come to the stage. I want a few minutes with the teams and the coaches, like literally 2 minutes while the judges get themselves settled, and then we will begin the round. Mr. Nate Sawyer will be the chair and timekeeper for the round. If I could have the coaches from Stratford and Bishop Burton.
Should we set up this? I already set it up.
If you all will come through, describe the physical support.
Don't go too fast, be loud.
What is the line?
29 for the second time. I have 28. I think I was counting Ricardo. Can't count. My eyes keep going cross-eyed. You need a ballot? I can't need a count. Count. Come here. Count. How many do you count? I got 28. Is that even number? Raising the possibility of 14. Huh? $50 on the first person who chokes on something right now. Oh, John Cruz. We weren't counting John Cruz.
Only because he can't.
Okay. I'm good.
On the cards, so emphasize, or you know what I mean, the box words, emphasize those, be especially clear on the cards. Just read it conversations. You know, it's just a normal speech. Well, huh? Can we borrow a flashlight?
Name?
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the final round of the Barkley Forum 24-hour tournament. Louder?
Mike, way to the bottom, Nate.
Way to the bottom.
No, of the mic, there's a little switch in here.
Is this the mic?
No.
This is the mic.
We are technologically sophisticated.
Can everyone hear me now? Yeah. Look at that competency. All right, everyone, welcome. Good afternoon to the Barkley Forum Finals. We have an excellent exhibition here for you today. We have two very talented debate teams. And we'd like to thank you for coming here, showing your support not only to the Barkley Forum as an institution, but also to this wonderful activity that we all partake in. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's debaters in the final round. First, on the affirmative team, we have the first affirmative, Dylan Ogle. Dylan, raise your hand. On the second affirmative, we have Kian Sanjeev. On the negative, we have the first negative, Ben Giuliano. And the second negative debater is Mike Demers. Without further ado, may the 1AC start.
There's the flashlight. Huh? No, you should start with, yeah, you're thinking.
So the final round of the Barkley Forum is a place I'd never really imagined being my sophomore year. In accordance with the tradition I've heard so much about, I'd first like to thank a couple people. I'd like to thank Melissa Wade for all of her behind-the-scenes work and the time she puts in for the community as a whole. Also Bill Nunman for all his hard work before the tournament. I'd also like to thank all the Barkley Forum and key coaches for taking the time to structure and execute such a well-run tournament. I'd like to thank the Key Coaches Society and the Emory debate staff, specifically James Herden and Ed Lee for all their management skills. Also, the Emory debaters for their guidance when transitioning from building to building. At home, I'd like to thank Margaret Brogdon and Dr. Robert Vito, our administrative staff, for giving us the opportunity to come to such a prestigious tournament. I'd like to thank my parents, Tom and Lynn Ogle, for tolerating my erratic schedule, all of the Stratford coaching staff, Eric Lanning, Jason Segalas, and especially Abby Shermer, who has truly been invaluable to the team, and my nerves. Last of all, I would like to thank Hemant Sanjeev, my partner, for giving me the privilege to debate with him his final year. He is truly one of the greatest debaters I've ever known, and I wish him beyond great luck in college and beyond. Without further ado, the plan. The United States federal government should substantially reduce its sanctions on Cuba. The advantage is credibility. The embargo destroys U.S. credibility and costs international capital. That's by Iglesias 12. International legitimacy and influence have a great deal to gain from a less unilateral approach. U.S. retort to UN anti-embargo resolutions has had long-standing blowback. This has undercut America's legitimacy and wasted political capital on the center world stage while depleting substantial national soft power. And sanctions have empirically failed. Only by removing the embargo will the U.S. send a signal of foreign policy coherence. That's Griswold 5. Sanctions have failed to change the behavior of any oppressive regime. The Chinese government has jailed or killed far more political and religious dissenters than the Cuban government. Chavez is doing more to undermine America's national interests. This is not an argument for an embargo against Venezuela, but for greater coherence in U.S. foreign policy. There's simply nothing special about Cuba that warrants the drastic option of a total embargo. And the plan itself reverses anti-Americanism and revitalizes diplomacy. That's Hill et al. 4-9. Cuba has intensified its global diplomatic and economic relations. It's hard to characterize such global engagement as isolation. The current embargo serves to prop up the Castro regime. The embargo has inspired significant diplomatic movement against U.S. policy. World leaders overwhelmingly cast their vote to announce American policy. It's time to change that policy. Broader economic engagement will promote a pluralist and open society. Leaders are calling for a real policy shift. Such a shift would register deeply in the minds of our partners and competitors around the world. And institutional legitimacy is the only way to exercise hegemony to prevent extinction. That's Cromon 9. After World War II, democratic institutions curbing the power of industrial trusts, constitutions in these countries were changed. Liberal ideas largely filled the cultural void. Germany's freedom of movement has been limited by domestic institutional constraints, overlain by a dense network of external institutional constraints. Thus, a powerful combination of constitutional design achieved the post-war American objectives of security. The hegemonic state is successful to the degree that other states emulate. Emulation is the basis of consent. U.S. benevolent hegemony is what has kept the peace since the end of World War II. As long as the system allows for democratic states to press claims and resolve conflicts, the system will be able to perpetuate itself peacefully. This view of a post-hegemonic Western world does not put a great deal of emphasis on U.S. leadership in the traditional sense. America, as a big and powerful state, has an incentive to organize and manage a political order that is considered legitimate. It is not in a hegemonic leader's interest to preside over a global order that requires the constant use of material capabilities. If a hegemonic power wants to encourage the emergence of a legitimate political order, it must articulate principles and norms. Institutional leadership refers to the rules and practices that states agree to set in place, procedures that guide their relations. It is not power capabilities as such or interventions of specific states that facilitate concerted action, but the rules. Institutions will need to play a much more important role. Institutions provide channels and mechanisms to reach agreement. It is more cleverness, specific opportunities to build or reorient international political order rather than the power capacities of a state that makes a difference. Benevolent hegemony is good for a vast portion of the world's population. It is this macro political system, a legacy of American power in its liberal polity, that remains and serves to foster agreement and consensus. Leadership may involve the ability not just to twist arms, but also to get other states to conceive of their interests. Institutions can permit cooperation to continue even after a hegemon's influence has eroded. Declining hegemony may therefore be consistent with a stable provision of desired outcomes. A second element of leadership, the ability to project a set of political ideals or principles about the proper effective ordering of politics, collaborative action by several states or other actors. By validating regimes and norms of international behavior, the U.S. has given incentive for actors to behave peacefully. And the plan itself builds U.S. credibility within these institutions and breaks the image of punitive unilateralism. That's Dickerson 10. Obama sees resuming relations with Cuba as a real step towards multilateralism and leadership. 184 nations voted against the embargo, a powerful statement about U.S. unilateralism with regard to Cuba. With a renewed focus on multilateralism, Obama could go a long way to break this image by spreading the seeds of a new beginning in U.S.-Cuban relations. And lifting the embargo would allow institutions to solve other major problems. That's Dickerson 10. It's time to chip away at the diplomatic wall that remains between the U.S. and Cuba. Obama will be seen as a true leader for multilateralism. Success in Cuba could afford the international momentum and credibility to solve other problems. Obama could leverage this international reputation. The U.S. could reverse its perceived decline, bringing peace. And changing policies is critical. Culture alone is not sufficient. That's 9-9. Opinion polls show a serious decline in American attractiveness in Latin America. When a poll respondents are asked why they report a decline in American soft power, they cite American policies more than American cultures or values. Because it is easier for a country to change its policies than its culture, Obama will be able to choose policies that could help recover some of America's soft power. An engagement with Cuba improves foreign policy credibility. Immediate success generates momentum. That's Colvin 08. A new approach to Cuba would send an important signal to the world. It would be relatively easy to demonstrate clear progressive change. Changes would send a strong message. The president will have to offer new policies that demonstrate a commitment to working with allies and pragmatic, engagement-oriented approach to foreign policy challenges. A diplomatic approach to Cuba would signal that the president is willing to pursue peaceful solutions to difficult problems. Compared with the difficult challenges, such as stabilizing Afghanistan or containing Iran, Cuba is an easy place to showcase change. We've been on a losing streak for so long, something that breaks the paradigm and shows bold strokes would have an enormous impact. And cross-regime cooperation causes broad global consensus, which solves international stability. That's Covenant Mountain 9. An order that welcomes political diversity would constitute a stark departure. Authority would not be concentrated in Washington. Western concepts of legitimacy would combine with those of other countries and cultures. A more inclusive order would encourage stability by broadening consensus and marginalizing states that are predatory. And decline itself is not inevitable. Smart policies like the plan can maintain relative U.S. power. That's 9-13. Stronger cases can be made for the positive over the negative. There are solutions to the major problems that preoccupy us. Decline is a misleading metaphor. The U.S. is likely to remain more powerful than any single state in the coming decade. The U.S. will be the first but not the sole. Even the largest countries will not be able to achieve the outcomes it wants without the help of others. And reputational legitimacy theory is true and key to foster relations. It's Gibler 8. Political scientists have adopted theories as tools in understanding signals leaders can send. Leaders have incentives to develop certain reputations in order to overcome uncertainty, crisis diplomacy. A reputation for honesty allows the sender to credibly give information that would otherwise be cheap talk, and thus leaders may concede less important issues. In order to maintain a reputation for honesty, when more important issues arise, decision makers act based on reputations. Reputations should be pursued by leaders as important tools which are useful in future crises.
Okay, my first question is, why does the removal of the singular policy of the United States embargo overcome a bunch of other policies that hurt legitimacy, such as drone strikes, Guantanamo, etc.?
Sure, so our Dickerson evidence indicates that Cuba, like the embargo itself, stands as a symbol of the U.S.'s adherence to outdated Cold War policies. Sure. Only by lifting the embargo are we able to generate the necessary credibility. The all causes that you just described are sure might exist, but they prove that we need to make a concession to the international community.
Okay, so that is true in the context of Latin America, I guess. Your 9-9 evidence specifically says that opinion polls show a serious decline in American attractiveness in Europe, Latin America, and most dramatically, the Muslim world. So how does the affect those two regions, which your evidence
The embargo
suggests
still exists as that symbol of those outdated Cold War policies. It would send a broad message that the U.S. is willing to work within the international community and make conciliatory policies and we'd be more capable of locking ourselves into those multilateral institutions.
Okay, I guess in the context of your Chroma 9 evidence, what is the, process by which the human race will go extinct in the status quo?
It's not necessarily that the human race would go extinct. It's that right now we're unable to unilaterally maintain primacy. Only by locking ourselves into these institutions are we able to hedge
the argument that the one you see forwarded, which is that the only way to exercise hegemony to prevent extinction is not true.
It's extinction more of in the sense of American power rather than just the extinction of the human race.
Surely. I guess then what crises or scenarios or international
Sure.
problems is this?
So by being in these credible multilateral institutions, it provides a forum for the discussion and resolution of conflicts.
So which conflicts?
I mean, the evidence doesn't really isolate any specific scenarios, but it definitely speaks more to the broader idea that institutions are able to be those conflict resolution mechanisms.
Okay, Shirley. The piece of Dickerson evidence describes issues such as North Korea and Iran. I guess, how do international institutions deal with those issues?
Sure. So we'd say, I believe it's our Cuppen and Mount evidence indicates that in these institutions, we would be more likely to marginalize predatory, states that are determined predatory in the eyes of the international.
How do we marginalize these states?
I mean, sanctions would be an effect of that, but not necessarily,
How do sanctions resolve anti-American backlash?
How do sanctions resolve? We don't really say they do. It's more of the Americans,
I
the
guess, how do you
anti-American
repair the
sentiment.
image then? How
What?
do you repair the United
Yeah,
States
but
image?
the embargo itself is an example of those kinds of.
All right, I will not be taking the prep time.
This is great already. Think so?
May I borrow the stand, please?
Oh yeah, of course. Thank you.
Ridiculous. What? No way. I'm so surprised. Bullshit.
The order will be one off-case position, and then the advantage. Before I begin my first negative constructive, I'd like to thank the Barkley Forum for providing me the opportunity to debate at the tournament. I'd also like to thank Melissa Wade, Executive Director of Emory Debate, and Ed Lee, the Director of Debate. Thank you to all of the key coaches that have paved the way for what we're about to do. Though they aren't here, I would also like to thank my parents for supporting me over the past 4 years of my debate career. They've sacrificed a lot, and they're enabling me to participate in this wonderful activity has been astounding. Congratulations to Stratford and to Abby Shermer for coaching a great team and their competitive success at this tournament last year as well as this year. I'd like to thank my coach Bruce Miller for keeping debate alive at my school, Bishop Girton in New Hampshire. It's his selflessness and dedication that allows us to travel to tournaments and get the experience that brings us to the top of our game and allows us to participate in the final round of such a prestigious tournament as this. And finally, I would like to thank my partner, Mike Demers, for being a fantastic companion in this journey. It's been a great ride, and I hate to think that this year is coming to an end so soon. I hope we can have a great end to the year. So. First off is the critique. The affirmative's hegemony strategy is not benign. It creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where the threats that they seek to prevent occur because of the U.S. attempts to maintain a political order. That's Amin in 3. The hegemonic strategy of the U.S. is articulated on the collective character of a new imperialism and to the weakness of the anti-neoliberal social and political movements. This strategy is the object of propositions. The first is that hegemony belongs to a gentle leadership. This discourse pretends that the U.S. acts in the interest of the peoples who are associated with the triad, to whom globalization offers the chance of development, reinforced by the benefits of democracy that the U.S. benefit from enormous advantage, that legitimizes their hegemony. American hegemony works from logic and a system that has little to do with the discourse it envelops. Rivals are, of course, Russia and China, adversaries that Washington may have to envision destroying if she continues to persist in her development. Other rivals also noted all southern countries that may develop a resistance to globalized neoliberalism, India or Brazil, Iran or South Africa. Objectives are therefore to vassalize the allies. And construction of threats by the affirmative is an example of biased research informed by the military, which ensures that we misunderstand how tensions arise in the international arena, creating war. Burke, 2007. Causes of war based on insecurities over a bedrock of reasons, ontological certainty amounts to a drive for ID national hegemony that limits debate within the boundaries of a closed system of logic. An epistemology of violence joined to an ontology of violence, each quicken the resort to war and its escalation. Militaristic forces reinforce norm of war. They enact an framing which humans are merely instruments for use and destruction. Foreign policy doctrine use force to achieve a desired end, supplied by the ontological claim to national existence, security, or order. Violence is married to an ontology of insecure national existence, which admits no questioning. The nation and its identity are prior. The next war is seen as a natural phenomenon. Ontologies of war link being and decision into a single chain whose process cannot be examined. Being implies war. Obsessive ontological commitments led to problematizations of truth. The need is to critique political being and dominant ways of securing that being. And the alternative is to vote negative because the 1AC is not true. The 1AC constructs threats and misrepresents reality. Presume negative. Krauss and Williams in 1997. Challenges to the conventional understanding of security necessitate an epistemological shift in the way that security is understood. This involves moving away from the objectivist, rationalist approach of neorealism toward more interpretive modes of analysis. To understand security from a broader perspective means to look at the ways objects, threats, and the means of securing them have shifted over time. Threats emerge, enemies are created, citizens become objects of violence. Former enemies can be members of the same community. The status of other is uncertain. To comprehend these processes requires an understanding of the problematics of security as constituted by self-reflexive historical praxis. Reality as the realm of subjective practice and structures becomes self-reflexive. We must grasp the genesis of particular security problems as grounded in concrete historical conditions. Go to the affirmative's case advantage. There is no uniqueness for this advantage. There is no evidence that indicates multilateralism is declining right now. Here is evidence that says the opposite. Walt in 2011. A preoccupation of diplomacy has been the need to reassure allies of reliability. U.S. leaders worried almost always exaggerated. The U.S. isn't going anywhere. Secure geopolitical positions, they have every incentive to make us worry about it, but in most cases little incentive to actually do it. And multilateralism empirically does not solve anything. Leaders refuse to comply, states will not cooperate, and it creates a cost for allies. Harvey in 2004. There are several problems with multilateral approaches to security. First, state leaders often refuse to do what the UN asks, are more than prepared to suffer sanctions, and are rarely directly affected by the sanctions. Second, actors fall outside of the institutional constraints imposed through global norms and regimes. International institutions lose the capacity to force compliance. Leaders of major powers will be compelled to respond to security threats through unilateral initiatives. This will force other powers to push harder to control American impulses. Third, the collective action argument assumes most states are governed by similar priorities, but the differences in overall competition among states are greater than proponents of multilateralism. Some states are more threatened by terrorism and proliferation, are less interested in securing peace, and experience pressure respective to distinct foreign policies. There is no guarantee states will have the same motivation to change the status quo. Multilateral organizations are less likely to act with urgency to address security threats. Fourth, multilateralism is not free of cost risks. One of the many important lessons of the Iraq War, there are no collective security guarantees any longer, even from traditional allies. Complex nature of contemporary security threats guarantees similar conflicts will plague multilateral institutions in the future. And the plan fails, and public backlash means it cannot solve in the long term. That is Lake in 2010. If any organization is to be effective restraint, other countries will have to make serious contributions to the effort. Other countries must contribute to the provision. Americans are likely to resist the idea of tying their hands in a new multilateral compact. And the affirmative's 9 evidence says that U.S. legitimacy is low not only in Latin America, but also in Europe and the Middle East. The affirmative does nothing to remove policies like drone strikes that fuel this anti-Americanism in those places, which means they cannot solve U.S. legitimacy. Guantanamo Bay, failure to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and joining the International Criminal Court are all other roadblocks to multilateralism and legitimacy that the affirmative does not resolve. Bergsdorf in 2009. Together with other measures, closing Guantanamo, signing Kyoto, putting into practice Bali, joining the ICC, ratifying the CRC will be interpreted as multilateralism. And there is no impact to hegemony. Statistics indicate there is no causal relationship between U.S. influence and power and global peace. That Weiss in 2011. There is no evidence to support a relationship between U.S. activism and international stability. The world grew more peaceful when the U.S. cut its forces. No state took any action. No militaries enhanced. No arms race. No regional balancing. The only evidence regarding systemic reaction to a restrained U.S. against peaceful trends are unrelated to a global policeman.
And the affirmative assumption that the international order would fall apart without a strong U.S. lead is wrong. Countries would not start fighting for no reason if U.S. legitimacy declines. That was in 2011. Assertions that without U.S. presence and instability would return are rendered in vague language. Where would this danger arise? Chinese spend 1/10 of U.S. levels. Threats posed by China would not be dire. Specific threats are more significant than vague, unnamed dangers. Basic psychology provides doubt. Rarely are our actions as consequential as we perceive. States overrate to the degree to which their behavior is responsible. Importance of U.S. hegemony and stability is overrated. Hegemonic stability can only be falsified, never proven. And there is no impact to U.S. credibility. That is McDonald and Parent in 2011. Opponents of retrenchment exaggerate the importance of credibility. Just because retreat from one commitment does not mean it will retreat from others. Concessions in one area need not be seen as influencing a commitment in another area. Abandoning commitment may bolster the strength of a commitment in another area. One of the affirmative's impact cards says that a Korean War would result in U.S. legitimacy decline. This is not true. Rational regime, empirics, military inferiority, and it's all just domestic propaganda. Fisher in 13. Is Korea irrational on the brink of launching war? Not. The North Korean regime has also shown itself to be shrewd, calculating, and obsessed with self-preservation. The regime's behavior suggests strongly threats are empty. For years, North Korea has threatened the worst and never gone through. The most plausible explanation has to do with Korean politics. I stopped that card at Korean politics.
Great. Okay. Are you ready for questions?
I am.
Okay. So, first on the critique, the Amen evidence seems to indicate that the U.S. is doing a lot of really bad things now. How does this, I guess, describe the plan?
It describes the plan because the affirmative attempts to maintain the strategy of doing these bad things. It says that the impacts that the affirmative isolates to a decline of U.S. influence in the world would not actually result unless the U.S. attempts to pursue them, because it is the U.S.'s...
Yeah, I guess the question is, what specifically about the plan of lifting the embargo is exactly that kind of building up of, like, U.S. hegemonic practices?
The affirmative's argument is that the only way to maintain U.S. hegemonic practices is to ensure U.S. legitimacy.
I mean, I feel like the advantage more is predicated off the desire to lock ourselves into multilateral institutions and to be more conciliatory. I don't really see where there's a disagreement with the critique.
There's a problem because the affirmative frames the reason for being more multilateral as so the U.S. can have more influence in those institutions and control them. Our argument is that ultimately results in violence because the U.S. ends up controlling everything and says that those people that do not follow the U.S.'s political order are bad and should be militarized against.
All right, okay, so the alternative says that we should just reject the F. How does voting neg in this debate attack the broader ideological structures that are, like, outlined in the critique?
Well, our alternative says that the affirmative's impacts and reasons for doing the affirmative are not true. It would not result in a collapse of the political order, so that is a reason that you should vote negative.
How does that specifically attack the structures that the critique critiques?
Because the affirmative says that they are the only way to prop up those violent structures. If the affirmative does not, if we do not vote for the affirmative, we do not vote for propping up those violent structures.
Sure. Okay, so your Fetweiss evidence seems to indicate that hegemony is, there's not really an impact to it. I guess, how is that descriptive of a world where we recognize that there is, like, hegemony is unsustainable?
Well, the affirmative doesn't do that because the affirmative thinks that it can make hegemony work just by being more multilateral.
Right, but I feel like
the hegemony does not actually prevent any global collapse.
The Fetweiss evidence seems to speak more, I guess.
Your only justification in the global collapse because the U.S. isn't leading anything.
I mean, the Fetweiss evidence, in my opinion, seems to speak more to, like, unilateral hegemony, and a line from it is, like, there's no evidence to support relation to it between U.S. activism and international stability. It seems more to speak that when the U.S. wants to push something,
yes, and
it's
all
not very
of the
stable.
1AC evidence says we need to,
but it's,
the only way to maintain
it seems more indicative of the U.S. acting on its own accord rather than with the cooperation of other countries.
The justifications for the affirmative are we work with other countries solely so we can promote our own interests in those institutions. You don't actually want real multilateralism because you just want the U.S. to control it.
All right, there's a debate to be had.
I do not need any prep. It's on there. It's TAC finals.
Thanks.
Could I borrow
Where's
the
that timer?
order is the credibility advantage and then the critique. So my computer shut off. Can I read from yours?
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. You could try to turn it on during this.
Yeah, I will.
That'd be great.
Do you know where your plug is?
Yeah. Here you go. I'll just sort of
Yeah.
get it around there. So the final round is obviously an amazing opportunity to participate in. And every year that I've been here, the tournament has always been exceptionally well run because of the efforts of the Barkley Forum and the Key Coaches Society, who I would like to deeply thank for taking the time to host it. I'd also like to thank Emory Debate. None of this would be possible without Melissa Wade, who makes contributions not just for Emory, but for the community writ large. I'd like to thank Bill Newnham and Herndon and Ed Lee, who have all been extremely supportive over the last 4 years. I'd also like to thank Stratford Debate for giving us the opportunity to travel around the country and compete. And we understand that it takes a lot of resources to do this, and we try our best not to take that for granted. I'd also like to give a big thank you to all of my coaches, my former partner Andrew Jones, who's always available to look at an app for me, Jason Segalos, whose enthusiasm for debate is always infectious, Eric Lanning, who always lightens the mood, and most of all Abby Shermer, who devotes so much time and energy to helping us out. She really does work tirelessly for our success, and I can't thank her enough. Stratford's a really small school, and I feel extremely lucky to have her as a coach. I'd like to congratulate and thank Bishop on making it this far. We've had sort of a rivalry going on this year, and they are always a really enjoyable team to debate. I'd like to thank my parents, because a lot of what we do is sort of confusing and they don't always understand it, but their love and support is what keeps me going. And lastly, I'd like to thank Dylan for all of his hard work and dedication. He's really, really young, but he's really doing a good job this year. It must be scary to be in this round as a sophomore, I remember from 2 years ago, but he takes it like a champ and he really loves debate, and I know he's going to do great things in the future. Is everyone good for my speech? I'll take that as a yes. The first piece of evidence states that multilateralism is increasing now. However, their evidence is largely descriptive of the status quo power relations of unilateralism. Our NIE evidence cites global opinion polls and states that opinions of the United States are declining. The evidence about reassuring allies with military capabilities does not apply and largely contradicts their critique argument. Our CHROMA evidence establishes that unilateral U.S. intervention and military action against other countries is unsustainable unless we engage in multilateral institutions. This is also largely consistent with the thesis of the critique that says the United States should act in a more equitable and democratic way towards other countries. Countries right now see the United States as maintaining an outdated Cold War policy, i.e. the Cuban embargo, which lifting gives us the credibility to lock ourselves into said multilateral institutions. They say that multilateralism fails. This evidence is also descriptive of the status quo rather than the world after the plan. U.S. credibility builds coalitions and restores faith in the liberal order, which improves the effectiveness of the system. The public backlash argument does not apply to our CHROMA evidence, which says that the U.S. populace is largely growing weary of unilateral interventions, giving us the impetus to lock ourselves into multilateral institutions. The drone strikes argument and these arguments about Guantanamo Bay and other roadblocks are essentially pessimistic. The affirmative at least does something to shore up the United States' credibility, while the alternative accomplishes nothing on either of these fronts, neither closing Guantanamo Bay nor ending the regime of drone strikes. However, these arguments prove the necessity of a concession to the international community. It is important for the United States to be less unilateral, to exercise its hegemony in a more benevolent manner. Our affirmative accomplishes this. Their no impact to hegemony evidence is again about military capabilities, which addresses an argument that we simply did not make. Their card that countries don't fight each other for no reason is also not applicable to the affirmative, because our argument isn't that countries will attack each other for no reason, but rather that there are deep-seated tensions that multilateral organization and sustained engagement within those organizations can solve. The no impact of credibility argument, the McDonald evidence is discussing military deterrent credibility, which I've already explained does not apply to the affirmative. Their last argument is that there will not be a war on the Korean Peninsula. We're fine with that. We can concede that there will be no war on the Korean Peninsula. However, there are multiple other scenarios for conflict that multilateral institutions would be useful in diffusing. Critique. The problem with this argument is that it's sort of trying to tie us to a lot of things that are not the plan. It should say something to you that the one on R basically did not use, or the one on C rather, essentially did not use the phrase Cuban embargo on this page. They have not tied any of their arguments to the direct consequence of removing sanctions on Cuba. This is the best way to evaluate policy. Brock in 97. The different goals of scholarship and policy call for different virtues. Philosophers who maintain their ways in the policy setting will fail in their responsibilities and will act wrongly. The first concern of policy ought to be the consequences of actions. Persons who participate in policy would be irresponsible if they did not focus on their concern for how their actions will affect people. When philosophers move in the policy domain, they must shift their commitment from truth to consequences. There's no evidence that the affirmative is a strategy of a drive for certainty. Our argument is that the United States should instead give up on some of the policies that it imposes on other countries in this drive for certainty. Their evidence speaks to a lot of complicated philosophical stuff like ontology and epistemology, but at the end of the day, the United States is not going to give up on maintaining influence. The central question of this debate is it better for the United States to maintain influence through a unilateral military strategy of intervention against other countries, or is it better to instead accept the democratic checks of multilateralism? Maintaining unipolarity turns all of their impacts. Finnemore and 9. Unipolars cannot create legitimacy unilaterally. One may not like the inequalities of global capitalism, but still believe that markets are the only realistic way to organize successful economic growth. Rejection of social structures and the withdrawal of their legitimacy create a crisis. Systems suffering legitimacy crises tend to be violent and non-cooperative. Material force alone remains to impose order. Unipolar power without any underlying legitimacy will meet with resistance. Trust will be thin to non-existent. Their endless warfare terminal impact is essentially hyperbole. Gray and 7. In the hands of a paranoid leader, prevention could be a policy for endless warfare. However, the American system was designed for the purpose of constraining the executive. Vietnam and Iraq reveal that war is disciplined by public attitudes. The claim that a policy that includes a preventive option might lead to a search for total security is not at all convincing. It should be dismissed for what it is, a debating point with little pragmatic merit. Our advantage and institutional hegemony avoids their offense and prevents conflicts. Eikenberry in 2004. The notion of empire misses distinctive aspects of the global political order. Advanced democracies operate within a security community. Economies are interwoven. This is a US-led democratic political order. Imperial vision fails to appreciate the cooperation and exercise in the preservation of power. There are limits on American imperial pretensions. The empire debate misses the long piece. Capitalism, democracy, and nuclear weapons all help explain this. They say that not voting affirmative means that we don't prop up violent structures, but voting negative does not actively get rid of those. They have no spillover argument about why academic discourse in this specific space can change the motivations of United States policymakers. Their Krauss evidence, however, says that we must challenge conventional understandings of security in this debate, which proves you can both agree that lifting the sanctions that the United States currently imposes on Cuba is a good thing, and also that conventional security logic is bad. In fact, the reason that we have the embargo in place in the first place is the same security logic that their evidence critiques, because we viewed Cuba as a threat and then tried to cloister them off of the global economy. However, we have a defense of the way that we view international relations. International liberalism is effective and distinct from their offense. Recchia and Doyle in 11. Relying on new insights from game theory, international regimes can help states effectively coordinate policies and collaborate in trade, arms control, and environmental protection. Multilateralism also reduces strategic competition over relative gains. Prolonged interaction in an institutionalized international setting can fundamentally change states' preferences. Liberal democracies are particularly enthusiastic about international cooperation. Transnational actors thrive in liberal democracies, and they frequently advocate increased international cooperation. Liberal democracies bind themselves into complex global governance arrangements to demonstrate strategic restraint, reducing the costs for maintaining international order. International cooperation is thriving. The terminal impact of this argument, or the reason that this argument really matters, would be that the 1AC scholarship was flawed, that we framed the world in a bad way. Which means if they win all of the arguments that they've made in the 1NC, it ultimately means that our discussion sphere was incorrect. This is not a reason to vote negative, but instead a reason that you should not vote on the hegemony advantage. There are other justifications for lifting the embargo as well, and if we find that one of those justifications is good, that is a reason to lift sanctions. For example, lifting the embargo would solve anti-disease efforts, Dickerson and 10. Our proximity to Cuba assures U.S. involvement. Consider a disease outbreak that begins in Cuba over a breakdown in hygiene, attributable to economic strife. Disease has no boundaries. This scenario could be mitigated or even preventable under the auspices of better relations. Communications would prevent an uncontrolled spread. And absent healthcare measures, disease will cause mass suffering. You in 2009. New viral strains are constantly emerging, a process that maintains the possibility of a pandemic-facilitated human extinction. The occurrence of antigenic drift and shift in influenza could produce a new version for which scientists may not find the cure. Since influenza can spread quickly, the time lag could lead to a pandemic, according to the CDC. I'm ready for cross-examination.
So, which countries fight each other if the United States no longer has strong influence in multilateral institutions?
Our evidence says that the credibility and other countries' faith in those institutions makes them an effective forum for settling disputes, which means there are conflicts that I can't predict exist right now that will come up in the future that are important. However, there are also scenarios...
You don't even know if there are disputes?
Well, I was also getting to some conflicts that exist now. So there are scenarios, for example, the conflict between India and Pakistan, where nationalist tensions could flare up and multilateral organizations could be an effective forum for settling those disputes.
And the United States' involvement is the only way to mediate those things?
It's not necessarily that, but rather that the credibility of those multilateral institutions is necessary to A, get them to resolve their disputes multilaterally,
Sure.
B, get them to accept the solution that those multilateral organizations propose.
Sure, so why is the United States key to that credibility of those institutions? There are lots of other countries in them.
The United States is such a big and powerful state that if we renege on our commitments to these international institutions, other countries will not feel like they have to engage in them either.
Wait, is it that I thought your argument was that the other countries don't like the United States because we have the Cuban embargo in place?
Yes.
Why would we renege on our commitments?
Right,
seems like the opposite.
those are the same thing, right? The United States is reneging on its international commitment to multilateralism by maintaining the Cuban embargo. 184 countries in the UN have voted repeatedly to condemn the Cuban embargo.
How does the United States maintaining the Cuban embargo prevent us from dealing with things like India and Pakistan?
Because the loss of credibility embargo prevents us from effectively engaging in those institutions. Countries do not believe those institutions are credible because the United States can maintain these outdated Cold War policies while claiming that it is multilateral.
So
the plan is a concession that disproves that.
You cite that there are global opinion of the United States is not popular now.
Yes.
So I guess I'm curious as to how the people in the Middle East would perceive the United States lifting the embargo on Cuba and how that would relieve tensions there. How would that relieve those?
I'll grant you is persuasive. However, I believe the general theory of our argument is still holds up. Right? It's that the United States makes a concession to the international community, which they long-standing cornerstone of its foreign policy, that convinces other countries the United States is moving towards engagement rather than containment.
Why do certain parts of the international community care about that at all?
The international community cares about that because it is such a long-standing cornerstone of the United States foreign policy.
Okay.
And until you
what
read
is
a
the
piece of
reason
evidence
why-
that disproves that, that argument will hold true.
What is the reason why the United States is necessary to solve Cuban disease when Cuba has a strong healthcare system now?
We would disagree with that.
Well, okay. What evidence in your do you read any evidence to support that Cuba?
That's the
disease?
Dickerson card?
Yes, your Dickerson card says that there would be no boundaries and the disease would move to the United States.
We're
And
gonna
it
take,
also makes the argument
we'll
that
take preparation time.
Thanks. It's just gonna leave. I can't believe they're going to okay.
I think or you
There.
could be it.
I just can't.
First is this is just such an awesome opportunity. Last year we lost our break round finishing 3-3, and I never thought we'd have the opportunity to make it to finals the year after. And this has just had a bunch of like 2-1 decisions, close debates. So this has just been an awesome ride. I'd like to from specifically Melissa Wade, Ed Lee, especially for the snack bag before doubles. That was really good. Bill Newnam for hosting the event, and just the organization to be here and debate in front of you all. I'd also like to debate the Emory debaters, Nate, for this and for being a bunch of help, navigating the campus, Jason, among other people for being a huge help whenever we needed. All of you all for each of your contributions to the forwarding of this activity in your own unique ways, your teams is now, and giving us the opportunity to what we do here. I'd like to thank my parents for their endless support and patience. I'd like to thank Ben for not only being an awesome 2A, but an even better friend. We've spent so much time together over these past 4 years, a small team. We often travel, just the two of us and our coach. And that's really, we've created a great relationship that I'm so thankful for. I'd like to thank Greg, Misha, Isaiah, and Dave, who are always there to support us in our endeavors. Stratford BG is a small team, and we work together powerfully and supportively, and I'm sure that Greg and Misha will get their second bid. I hope they do. Bruce Miller, who does so much for us. He organizes everything we do, and he devotes endless weekends away from his family. Finally, congrats to Stratford and Abby Shermer. Y'all are a force to be reckoned with. I really enjoy the rivalry that we've had this year, but especially Dylan. I remember debating you at the Green Hill Round Robin, which I think was your first tournament of your sophomore year, and seeing you grow in just a semester has been truly remarkable. And I think all of you can think of fond experiences of the sophomore year of debate. It's a very unique year. They often have the most enthusiasm, but also not much experience. So that seeing him grow has been really great. The order is just the criticism. All right.
Yeah.
Our argument is that a bunch of sense until they started talking about large-scale impact scenarios such as extinction. Our argument calls into question their utilization of apocalyptic impact claims, proven by the 1AC's tag of their chroma piece of evidence, which is that it's necessary to prevent extinction. This is how you should evaluate a policymaker presents a course of action and then justifies it using particular metrics of justification. Utilize what we call constructive threats in order a particular course of action. Our piece of evidence from Anthony Burke says that backing claims with apocalyptic rhetoric is extremely dangerous. There are two warrants to this claim. First, This rhetorical choice can have dangerous consequences by motivating the audience, you all, that the policymaker is attempting to reach to use completely different policy in tandem with the plan. Specifically, their discourse will result not only in lash out by the United States, which is vividly described by their chroma evidence as the practice of arm twisting and the increase of sanctions, which is ironically what the 1AC seeks to remove in the first place, is their strategy for resolving conflict in the future. This is more likely to result in people will deem the particular state in question as a threat to the international order. Our argument is that we should not approach tensions through the idea of arm twisting. Rather, we should view it through the lens of equality and true forms of multilateral cooperation, which is a better form of policy. This has been seen in the past decades through President Bush's positioning of terrorism as being a threat that resulted in the invasion of Iraq and the subsequent civil war and atrocities. Second reason and warrant to this claim is that it becomes a perpetual or continual process. Our evidence indicts the 1AC's authorship as being biased by continuously militarization of the social sciences. What this means is that their scholars are more focused on what the military perceived as threats than the actual reality of the international arena. This is clearly seen in the military's human terrain system, which uses anthropology as a tool to wage war, which benefits private arms contractors. This is uniquely true in the context of the 1AC and their plan text because their main sovereignty advocate is Sergio Dickerson, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. military, and this proves that the 1AC authorship has an invested interest in war making. This means you would be able to pursue an international strategy of arm twisting, which is all of our arguments linked to, and describe why that is a destructive and bad form of policymaking to go about in the international arena. The 1AC is not a giving up on bad policies. You can vote negative on presumption because their chroma evidence specifically says that the 1AC's strategy would allow us to enforce policies such as sanctions. This is ironically what the 1AC tries to remove in the first place. They would allow for broad-scale implementation of sanctions beyond the U.S. embargo and would ensure that we continue to alienate regions such as Europe and the Middle East, which their own 9/9 evidence says is critical to the U.S. image. Their next argument is that unilateralism is worse. This is not a forced choice. You have the choice to endorse a policy of multilateralism which does not embrace the practice of arm twisting and U.S.-led international order. The 1AC is grounded in U.S. leadership. We reject this idea and say that we should ground multilateral institutions such as the UN on equal participation without one leader that dictates policies. This is not a form of hyperbole. The Burke evidence describes that when the military infiltrates how we make decisions, this makes more likely violent solutions. It is not some dystopian endless warfare that their evidence describes, but rather the result of self-fulfilling prophecies that are proven by multiple empirical examples such as I explained above. Their next argument is that voting negative does not get rid of these policies. As I explained above, you can vote negative to endorse a new form of multilateralism that rejects the forced choice between unilateralism and benign hegemony in multilateral institutions. That is a better form of politics. Their next argument is that we can lift sanctions and securitize bad logic. Our argument is not simply that securitizing logic is bad, but rather the arm twisting that is a consequence to the 1AC is a bad form of politics and makes the crises they seek to attempt more likely in the future. We fundamentally agree with their game theory argument and simply suggest that arm twisting is a bad strategy to combat the harms described by their theory. Their last argument is the disease atom. However, their Dickerson 10 evidence is about a hypothetical scenario in which a disease outbreak occurs in Cuba. They read no evidence that suggests the propensity of such an event. Cuba has one of the best healthcare industries in the world. Their card says such a disease could spread because of travel, but this does not hold up because the United States has a travel ban on Cuba, which prevents large-scale travel. It also ignores a series of checks, such as we would cancel flights, we would provide vaccines in a time of emergency, which means this is not a risk.
Are you ready?
Sure.
Cool. So, why is proving that one thing about the 1AC is incorrect a reason to vote negative?
why is proving one thing is incorrect?
So you said at the beginning of your
Sure.
speech, for example, that you agreed with the entirety of the 1AC except when we said the word extinction. Why is that a reason to vote for
I don't
you
think
rather
that
than
is our
us?
argument entirely. We disagree with the framing of extinction as a way to base this discussion. However, we isolated several disadvantages to the plan text, such as your international strategy of arm twisting and sanctions, which was described very specifically in 1AC crossings.
So where did you read an impact to arm twisting and sanctions?
Sure. The 1AC Burke evidence describes that when we
The Burke evidence doesn't use the word sanctions, I'm sorry.
Sure. I applied that analysis as an example that is also described by your evidence. So the Burke evidence describes that a U.S. international-led order, such as institutions by the UN, allows for this strategy of arm twisting, and sanctions are an example of that.
So where's the piece of evidence that sort of compares the two options between arm twisting and an international political order that is not led by the United States?
Sure.
Where's the card that arm twisting is net bad in the grand scheme of things?
Sure. The Krause and Williams evidence, along with additional analysis that we have done, suggests that we can refuse this form of offensive leadership in favor of a true form of equality that bases policy in institutions such as the UN on a cooperative framework where we do not have a, quote, benign leader such as what the 1AC
I guess my next question then is, where is the piece of evidence that if the United States were to give up on leading these institutions, the result would then be countries just engaging equitably and cooperatively?
We have read multiple pieces of evidence on that. A couple of cards are the Fetweiss evidence, which we read in the 1C, describes that a decline in U.S. influence was not statistically correlated with an uptake in tensions, but rather it resulted in more peaceful and equitable forms of cooperation.
That doesn't really answer the question that I'm asking, right? Where is the piece of evidence that if the United States were to give up on leading international institutions, other countries would compete or would cooperate democratically within those institutions?
I think the Fetweiss evidence supports that claim, along with the Harvey evidence we read, that suggests that when we back off from the attempt to rule these institutions, which are supposed to be multilateral in the first place, and we pursue a policy that respects, the wishes of all countries, and we do not attempt to have leadership, can we better resolve the tensions of the status quo?
That seems sort of like a false choice to me. Where did you read a piece of evidence that the United States will sort of allow this regime of equitable cooperation to exist while giving up on United States leadership?
Sure, we think that, like you described, the judges have a choice of policy. You can affirm the 1AC's policy of arm twisting via removing the new multilateral policy advocated by the negative.
But that policy doesn't exist.
You're advocating.
Do I have the flashlight?
Yeah.
I'm not going to be taking preparation time. It's just going to be the advantage.
Thanks.
Is everybody ready?
Just a minute.
Yes.
Good to go.
Everybody ready? The fundamental problem with this advantage of the affirmative is that lifting the Cuban embargo cannot resolve any of the bad things that the affirmative says will occur. This should be sufficient reason to vote negative, because if the affirmative does not do anything good, then you can vote negative on presumption. I'd first like to address the arguments about the failures of multilateralism. Heman says all of our arguments about why multilateralism will fail are only true of the status quo and are not true of a world that increases its influence in international institutions. This is not true. The reasons we isolate for why multilateralism fails are structural reasons that cannot be resolved by lifting the Cuban embargo or resolving U.S. influence in any way. First, state leaders will refuse to comply with multilateral requirements regardless of who is in charge of the institutions, and they are not afraid of consequences of affirmative. Even under a U.S. lead, they will not get all states to work together because they do not have the same goals and they all have different desires. The United States cannot change that fact about their incentives. Finally, multilateralism incurs some cost to our allies. The Iraq War proves that this deters broader cooperation. This was all in the 1NC Harvey evidence, and the 2AC it fails to address any of the specific warrants that this isolates. Lifting the embargo cannot solve any of these structural problems with multilateralism. Next, I'd like to address the arguments about why there are too many things that prevent multilateralism from being effective that the affirmative doesn't solve. He-Man just says that these arguments are pessimistic, but sometimes, just because they are pessimistic doesn't mean they are not true. If the affirmative is not sufficient to resolve multilateralism in all instances, they cannot claim that the affirmative does anything good, and it is sufficient reason to vote negative on presumption. First, there is a unilateral sentiment in the United States that takes out any hope of affirmative solvency. The American people do not want to entangle the United States in new foreign commitments. Future policymakers will listen to these constituents that do not want the U.S. to get entangled, and they will not pursue further multilateral policy, which means multilateralism can never be sustained. The affirmative ultimately fails. This was the 1NC piece of Lake evidence that I read. Another piece of evidence I read in the 1NC was Bergsdorf. He says that Guantanamo Bay, Kyoto Protocol, the International Criminal Court are all crucial to effective multilateralism. They are things that the affirmative does not do. It means that there is zero risk of solvency, and you can vote negative on presumption if they go for disadvantage. Either all of these things are just as important as the affirmative and they do not resolve them, all of these things are just as important in the affirmative and they do not resolve them. Finally, I would like to address the arguments about why U.S. leadership doesn't actually resolve anything. He-Man just dismisses all of my arguments in the 2AC by saying they are all about military power, but that is not a reason they don't still apply, because the piece of evidence he says as to why U.S. hegemony is good in influencing institutions is so that we can deploy our military power more effectively. Our arguments are that this military power will not ever be effective because hedge never works. We read a piece of Fetweiss evidence that says all of the data points to the fact that a decline in U.S. influence in the world actually results in more peace. This is the opposite claim that the affirmative is making. Here's some more evidence. There is no plausible scenario that hegemony will solve war. Goldstein and 11. Relative U.S. power and conflict have waned in tandem. Iraq and Afghanistan have made lopsided the concert of Europe maintained peace for a century. China military spending is a distant second. Conflict would impede China's trading posture. And empirics prove hegemony is useless. That's Mearsheimer in 2010. The U.S. has been at war 2 out of every 3 years since 1989. The military is not going to win conflicts. Be stuck in quagmires for years. The U.S. has been unable to solve major foreign policy problems. Iran, North Korea, Israel, Palestine conflict. None of these things are going to be resolved by the affirmative, which is a reason that you should vote negative on presumption, because the affirmative cannot do anything good.
We'll take that.
Yep. Yes. No. Sorry. Framework. I mean.
Okay, we're good. Cool. We're going to compile the documents.
Here you go. If I could just get that back. Thank you.
Yep. The order is going to be credibility and then the critique. Are you guys good? Okay. No, not a problem.
Talk loud, please.
Not a problem.
Thank you. Not as old as
You good then? Cool. First, on the credibility page, the embargo, or lifting the embargo, shores up U.S. credibility. Even if multilateralism isn't terribly effective, the affirmative allows the U.S. to lead coalitions of the willing that countries will respect, which addresses their Harvey evidence. This means that the U.S. will not have to revert to unilateral policies. States have different motives, but unilateralism can reconcile those motives and provide a forum. And they say that unilateral sentiment is inevitable, but it's only a question of credibility. If the U.S. is perceived as legitimate, it will lock itself into the international system and renege on its military commitments, which solves their critique. Guantanamo Bay and the IIC prove our policy is in need of change. The plan's concession revitalizes diplomacy and prove we're willing to engage with partners. And their hegemony defense is just too generic. Our argument is not about military power, but rather U.S. influence and credibility as its power declines. This credibility can allow us to resolve disputes that otherwise would have caused war in a unilateral world. And even if they don't win a lot of these arguments, the AF does something to make the U.S. less unilateral, while voting neg doesn't actually do anything. On the framework question, the debate should center around whether the consequences of the plan are a good or bad idea. You should assume the role of a policymaker. There are infinite ways to call into question the underlying philosophy or ideology of the affirmative, but at the end of the day, it is a good idea to lift sanctions on Cuba. Having a flawed 1AC is not a reason to vote negative. If this were true, debate would just stop after 2 speeches. We believe that if our scholarship is flawed, you should simply just not vote on that specific scholarship. The alternative they propose is to refuse to prop up the hegemonic state. You can agree that the hegemonic state is bad with your ballot, but vote affirmative because we actually solve some tangible instance of suffering. Debate about consequences is important. Our Brock evidence says anything else breeds philosophical irrelevance because it prevents us from looking at the results of our actions because we are so caught up with the ideological underpinnings of those. Their argument is essentially that there is one part of the 1EC that is flawed and that we should lose because of that one small part. This sets an unnecessarily high threshold for the AF because the neg could just disagree with one word of the 1AC instead of focusing on the public policy. There is a cost to reading bad scholarship even under our framework because we lose a significant time commitment that was applied by just reading it. And this means we can incorporate critique and learn why it is important to challenge hegemony without completely abandoning the reason we're here, to discuss policy. And their argument for apocalyptic rhetoric does not apply to the 1AC. Our evidence argues arm twisting is bad, that's the Chroma evidence, and that unilateral strategy and militarism are bad. The rhetoric of the 1AC is a limit on U.S. intervention rather than a strategy of American exceptionalism. And our evidence does cite the military, but they are arguing that we should intervene less in international conflicts. Our impact scenarios are not absurd, and the negative should instead prove the scenario is false rather than breeding false complacency. And they say cycles of violence are inevitable. However, our gray evidence cites democratic checks in the American political system which prevent endless military intervention. So they say their arm twisting arguments and sanctions are bad. Those sanctions exist now, and arm twisting is occurring now. Our evidence says multilateral institutions motivate change amongst other countries. Even though arm twisting has hurt other countries, it is ultimately in the greater good because it maintains stability in the international order. They say that we lead to sanctions. Not all sanctions undermine credibility. Only the embargo on Cuba is a long-standing cornerstone that alienates other countries. Other sanctions on Iran and North Korea are distinct from our argument. Okay. voting negative does not resolve their offense. This is their alternative. U.S. policymakers will remain committed to U.S. influence, and the idea that voting negative reconceptualized multilateralism is a pipe dream. Our Fenimore evidence says the plan's soft landing is the most effective route, and our disease argument is meaningful, and it was mishandled by the negative. The affirmative provides public disease assistance to Cuba, which allows them to update and revamp their health infrastructure. This prevents disease outbreaks and allows us to contain them. Even if it doesn't spread globally, it is meaningful to the people who would otherwise not be affected. They've conceded you can vote AFT to both challenge conventional conceptions of security while also lifting sanctions on Cuba. Nothing about the plan requires you to have a conventional conception of security, especially in light of the 2AC's alternative justification.
Negative 3 minutes and 47 seconds.
the one to do.
credibility advantage, and then the criticism. The primary factor in your decision should be solvency. In order for the affirmative to win this debate, they must win the plan can solve a harm in the world. If you have any reasonable doubt that multilateralism will fail as a policy, then you should vote negative for the status quo, because there's only a chance the AF results in something worse. The 1NR gave lucid detail on a bunch of reasons why it'll fail. The 1AR blows them off and suggests that it is a forced choice between the plan and something else. However, if you conclude the plan will fail, then you should vote negative because the status quo is better. I will first extend our Harvey evidence. It describes 3 reasons why multilateralism will fail. The first is that countries will not comply. Countries such as North Korea, Iran will not comply with U.S. interests. This is also proven by larger powers such as Russia and China, demonstrated by the failure of recent multilateral developments such as the Cancun talks and the Kyoto Protocol. Now, this means that their only explanation for how the affirmative could solve something, which is coalitions, does not work, because our argument means those coalitions never happened, because a coalition presumes common interest. Our argument is that that common interest does not exist in the international system. The second reason is that countries fall out of the realm of constraints. Their multilateral policy argument presumes that we can have a punishment system. Our argument is that countries that fall outside of the international order are not susceptible to this form of diplomatic punishment, which means we have no ability to preserve the multilateral order that way. The second reason the affirmative does not solve is our Bergsdorf's evidence. The 1EC's explanation for solvency is that if we remove one small policy that relates only to Latin America, then that will repair the U.S. image globally. That is absurd. Their NIE evidence describes broad-scale opinions lacking in regions such as Europe, and it even says, most dramatically, the Middle East. Our Bergsdorf's evidence describes policies such as the U.S. drone war, which is causing widespread backlash in the Middle East that the affirmative has no ability to counter, or such as offensive policies in Europe and tensions between U.S.-led institutions such as NATO and their relations with countries such as Russia. These are all problems with the status quo the affirmative cannot solve. This is the only ability for them to resolve anything in this debate. If we prove that multilateralism as a policy structurally solves, then that means the status quo is better. This is the only justification for voting for the affirmative, which means you should not default affirmative on any risk. Go to the criticism page. You should ask yourself in this debate, why did the Kyoto Protocol fail? Why did the Cancun talks fail? Our argument is that their understanding of benign U.S. leadership presumes a false sense of neutrality in the multilateral systems. They ignore that countries have diverse interests and that pursuing multilateral policies that are led by U.S. interests cause widespread backlash. Their chroma evidence describes the 1EC's policy strategy as being one where we lead multilateral institutions to pursue U.S. interests in more benign ways, such as proven by the 1EC cross-examination sanctions, which is ironically exactly what the 1EC says is problematic in the first place. This proves our self-fulfilling prophecy argument because they reify the problem in the first place. Countries such as Iran, North Korea become the new Cubas under the 1EC's policy strategy because their form of multilateralism can only lead to a new global form of sanctions. Now, their disease argument is nonsensical because it first presumes a couple of problems that I isolated in the 2NC. First is that Cuba has a magnificent healthcare industry in the status quo. U.S. help is not necessary. Second is that they ignore a bunch of emergency checks, such as cancellation of flights, vaccines, etc., that all resolve the impact resolve this impact to the disease argument. They have no explanation for why disease exists in Cuba now, which means this suffering simply is not a risk to your ballot. You should reject the 1AC's offensive stance in multilateral institutions such as the UN that only cause greater backlash against the 1AC, and that framing it in terms of this apocalyptic broad-scale impact is both empirically denied and only ensures broader policy failures in the future. Thank you.
How much time do we have, Nate?
Actually, you have 1:05.
Cool.
It's the credibility advantage and then the critique. Is everyone good? All right. The 2NR has misdiagnosed the debate. The negative cannot just say that the affirmative is not that good. That is obviously not a reason why lifting sanctions on Cuba is bad. It is instead a reason why lifting sanctions on Cuba might not be as good as you thought it was at the beginning of the debate. However, you can still conclude that it is a net good idea to lift sanctions on Cuba, and most debates turn out this way, where the affirmative doesn't win 100% of the 1AC, but rather wins a solid claim that the 1AC can meaningfully affect United States credibility and that that credibility is meaningful in solving some dispute. The argument that solvency is a sufficient reason to vote negative is essentially a self-serving and arbitrary interpretation for them to point out one thing that is incorrect with the 1AC and then use that as a justification for voting negative writ large. This would ultimately mean that we would consider policy in a very parochial and inaccurate way that ignores the broader systems that surround policymaking itself. The arguments that multilateralism fails do not take out the advantage. The United States is still more likely to lock itself into multilateral institutions if it has the credibility to do so. Our chroma evidence says the United States believes that military capabilities are unsustainable and that it cannot exercise unilateralism indefinitely. It is only a question of whether or not the United States believes it has the credibility to engage in multilateral institutions democratically and equitably, which is a phrase that is repeated many times in the 2NC, proving that the affirmative is consistent with the critique. The negative even agrees that sanctions are a bad thing. There's a line in the 2NR when they say Iran and North Korea become the new Cubas. The implicit presumption of that is that our policy towards Cuba right now is unethical and that we should change that. That is a sufficient justification to vote affirmative, even if you're not buying a lot of this credibility advantage. They say that other countries don't comply. The only examples in the 2NR are Iran and North Korea, which obviously don't reflect the majority of the international community. U.S. leadership is also important to encouraging compliance. You should call for the Doyle evidence after the debate that states that when other countries see a great and powerful nation like the United States engaging genuinely in multilateral institutions by making concessions to the international community, their expectations change, and they are more likely to seek out multilateral institutions to resolve their disputes. This means that conflict is less likely in a world of multilateralism and more likely in a world of unilateralism. They say that there are no common interests. This argument is clearly totalizing. Our Doyle evidence states that there are clear overlaps between different states' interests. They say that countries that fall outside of the multilateral system are not punished. This puts them in a double bind. If countries that fall outside of the multilateral system are not punished, it doesn't matter that the United States pushes its values on the multilateral system. We will not do things like sanction other countries. However, the 2NC agrees that there is a punishment mechanism and there is an incentive to comply with the multilateral order as long as it is credible. They say we only lift one policy and that our internal link claim is absurd. It's not as absurd as their evidence sort of tries to come to grips with, because the 2NR has not read a single piece of evidence that cites the word Cuba or our Cuba policy or the effect that lifting that would have on other countries. We have read multiple pieces of evidence that lifting the embargo can shore up our credibility and that it is a long-standing symbol of United States adherence to outdated Cold War policies. It is a key symbol of unilateralism. The plan can change this, which also affects the path dependencies argument in our Doyle evidence. They say the Middle East and drones. This doesn't deny that the concession of the 1AC can build soft power. Now the critique. We agree with the negative that it's worthwhile to discuss the justifications for the 1AC, but bad justifications ultimately mean that you should just not vote on those justifications. At the end of the debate, if you think that it's a bad idea to lift sanctions on Cuba because they're unethical, because they deny healthcare access to some people, for example, you should vote affirmative. The closest thing they have to a reason the plan is bad is that arm twisting is a bad thing. However, they have not provided an alternative policy route, which proves that the choice that they isolate as false is not as false as they think it is. The choice is between United States unilateralism and multilateralism. Our Finnemore evidence that we read in the 2AC says that United States policymakers will never give up on preserving American leadership. The affirmative allows us to exercise that leadership in a way that is net more benign, that accepts at least some democratic checks. Even if it only results in a check on one intervention, this is meaningful for the people who would be involved in those interventions in the first place. They say that the Kyoto Protocol proves that multilateralism fails. Our argument is that leadership can solve effective dispute settlement and that it encourages countries to look to multilateral institutions rather than war as the source for dispute resolution. They say that the United States pursues its own interests. Our argument is that those interests are better pursued through multilateralism rather than unilateralism. We will inevitably try to pursue those interests. It's only a question of how we do so. The sanctions argument is not as ironic because Iran and North Korea are not threats to the United States or the international order. Our argument is that Cuba is not a threat to the international order, while those countries have historically rejected it. I'm not going to extend the disease add-on, so even if that is incorrect, that is not a reason to vote negative. The affirmative meaningfully affects the United States' engagement in multilateral structures, which is the reason to vote at.
Like a good bit.
Is it alright if I flash the issue?
Yeah. Is that the first time the Ned's ever gone for the K?
I think it actually
I
is.
think it probably is.
Judge choice.
Judge choice, though.
I feel like even understand judge choice.
Yeah,
It's such
that
a
might be
coin
true.
toss.
It might only benefit you.
You know, it's
Yeah.
such a coin toss.
I know.
It's like judge choice. Everyone out there.
Gentlemen, congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Okay. We just went for neolib. They were neoliberal and one's bad.
Why did who sat?
Tolungian. She just said the app wasn't neoliberal. She was just like, you're at least a good instance of it. Yep. Beat the crowd. There's gonna be like 40 people calling for cards in like a second.
I think not as many cards this year. It's like, don't have to resolve.
That's
Has
true.
the plan been done? Or
That's
has
true.
it not been?
That was the worst. Yeah, that was great. Last year.
So, something to talk about a lot is 2NR and 2AR stuff.
Yeah.
Jason, it's like at the top of the 2NR. He made that look back. So this space. So
Yeah, I'm gonna be here tonight.
I don't know if you normally do that. You didn't do it in the code base, but
Thank you.
That's good.
How'd it go?
It was okay. They went for the K.
Yeah, I know.
But howdy. I thanked you in my speech. Really? Yeah.
I didn't even know that the finals were starting this morning. I thought it started later.
Maybe you should have thanked you. I see how it is.